Hello. I'm so pleased to welcome everyone here tonight to come listen to Dan Grunfeld deliver the 5th annual Art and Mary Schumann Lecture, From Auschwitz to the NBA. My name is Bob Erlewine. I am a professor of religious studies in the Department of History and Philosophy here at EMU, and I am the director of the Eastern Michigan University's Center for Jewish Studies. I'd like to take a moment to thank our friends at Hillel for helping us advertise, and I would like to thank the foundation for their fundraising efforts on our behalf, and it really makes what we do possible. Before I begin introducing our speaker, I would like to say a few words about Art and Mary Schumann, for whom this annual lecture is named. It is difficult to overstate how important Art and Mary have been for the success that the Eastern Michigan University Center for Jewish Studies has enjoyed. They have been active members of the advisory board of the center since its inception, and in so many ways, they have helped the center navigate challenges and thrive. It is such a privilege to have this lecture carry their names. I would also like to take care of a couple of little housekeeping business first. My student assistant Theodore is over there, and I will ask if you are a student at EMU and you're here and you'd like LBC credit, or if a professor is offering extra credit, please make sure you sign in over here with Theodore, if you didn't already. For our community members in the audience, I have two quick announcements. First, it would also be great, we would greatly appreciate it if you too signed in. It helps us keep track of our numbers, and it helps us, you'll have the option of receiving communications from us about events. You can decline, but it helps us if you sign in. The other thing I want to say is we have parking vouchers. So after the event, please come see me, and I'll be able to get you to take care of your parking for tonight. Before I introduce our speaker, I would also like to briefly call attention to the Center for Jewish Studies' next event. At 7 p.m. on October 30th, Professor Maya Barzilai will deliver the 2nd annual Martin B. Schickman Lecture. Just in time for Halloween, Professor Barzilai will deliver a talk on that most Jewish of monsters, the golem. Her talk is titled, Our Golems Ourselves, What the Golem Narrative Teaches About the Modern Human Condition. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dan Grunfeld. Dan is the author of By the Grace of the Game, The Holocaust, A Basketball Legacy, and an Unprecedented American Dream, published with Triumph Books in 2022. In this book, Dan details how his grandparents survived the Holocaust and, with their children, fled communist Romania, arriving in the US in 1966. Dan's father, as some of you already know, is Ernie Grunfeld. He won the gold medal with Team USA in the 1976 Summer Olympics for basketball, and had an illustrious career in the NBA, first in terms of playing for the New York Knicks and other teams, and then serving as an executive, including the general manager for teams, including the Washington Wizards. Like his father, Dan is quite an achiever. As an academic, All-American, and All-Conference basketball selection at Stanford, he played basketball professionally for leagues around the world, including Germany, Spain, and Israel. And in addition to this book, Dan's writing has been published in such venues as Sports Illustrated, the Jerusalem Post, and the NBC News. It is our great privilege to welcome Dan tonight to deliver the 5th annual Art and Mary Schumann Lecture.
going to raise this just a little bit. No disrespect there, Bob. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be here at EMU. Art and Mary Schumann, my gratitude goes to you for sponsoring this event. It's wonderful to be here. So my plan is I want to talk to you for about 30 or 40 minutes about my family story. As mentioned, I wrote a book about it recently, and so the story is detailed in the book. Rarely do you get to hear about basketball and the Holocaust, right? So we're going to cover a lot of ground here. The story means so much to me. We were talking at dinner about being a third generation, meaning the child of people whose parents survived the Holocaust, right? Those are my grandparents, and how much the history still matters to us. And I have a day job and I have a family at home, but I fly around the country to talk about this story because of how much the history still impacts me, right? We learn about the Holocaust in school. It's something that happened a long time ago, but it didn't happen that long ago because my grandmother was there and my grandfather was there. And so I'm gonna tell you all about them, and then we'll have time for questions. I'm gonna put this water on the floor. And I hope that you'll ask questions when we're all said and done, because that's usually the most rewarding part of this, is for us to have a discussion. So, as was mentioned so eloquently by Bob, my family name is synonymous with the game of basketball. And that's not because of me. That's because of my dad. My dad's name is Ernie Grunfeld. He is regarded as one of the greatest Jewish athletes of all time. People say he's the second greatest Jewish basketball player of all time. Does anyone know who the first greatest is? Dolph Shays. That's a good trivia question. Dolph Shays is the greatest. My dad is regarded as one of the greatest basketball players and one of the greatest Jewish athletes of all time. He was a high school basketball All-American out of Queens, New York. He was a college basketball All-American at the University of Tennessee, and he was a longtime NBA player and executive. So he played 9 years in the NBA, and he was an NBA general manager for 30 years. So he spent 42 straight seasons as part of an NBA basketball team. That's all well known. You could find that out by Googling him. People have known that for some time. But what wasn't known until my book came out is that my dad is the only athlete in NBA history whose parents are Holocaust survivors. I did a year and a half of research preparing to write my book, and that research suggests that my dad is the only athlete in any of the major American sports. So the NFL, the NHL, Major League Baseball, or the NBA, my dad is the only one whose parents are Holocaust survivors. And the name of the lecture was mentioned, from Auschwitz, the infamous concentration camp in Poland, where my great-grandparents were killed and many of my great-aunts and uncles, to the NBA, right? How do you make that journey from the darkest part of human existence that we know of to the triumphs of sports stardom? Let me tell you how it happened. Despite my dad's great success that I've talked about and all he's accomplished, it's my grandmother who is the star of our family and the star of our story. You'll all be happy to know that she turned 98 years old in June. Wow. Thank you. Yeah, please clap. She deserves it. I was mentioning at dinner, we FaceTime every day with my two boys. I had to call her yesterday and tell her I'm going to be in Detroit tomorrow, so you're not going to hear from me. She said, as long as I know you're okay, we don't have to worry about it. My grandmother is such a dear part of my life, and I'll tell you more about our relationship. She's from Transylvania. I know a lot of us have heard of Transylvania. I talk to groups of students, a little younger than you all, who think Transylvania is just a cartoon or Dracula. Of course, we know about those things. It's actually a real place in the world. It's where my grandmother is from. She was born on the border of Romania and Hungary into a big, happy, Orthodox Jewish family. She had 9 siblings, so there were 10 of them. They had no running water in their house. They had no electricity. There were no roads in her hometown. But she had a lot of love and a lot of laughter. And when we do FaceTime and she hears my boys, running amok and laughing and joking, she says, that's music to me, because that's what my house sounded like when we were growing up. For those of you who have read my book, and hopefully some of you are going to after this evening, you'll know that I go to great lengths at the beginning of the book to describe what life was like for my family before the Holocaust, because we know the numbers. 6 million Jews killed and millions more. But these weren't just numbers. These were people, right? These were the people that my grandmother, who I talk to every day, loved more than anyone. So I really wanted to convey what life was like for them. And so they grew up in a big, happy Orthodox Jewish family, as I mentioned. My great-grandfather was a pretty successful landowner, an amazing man, and he's my grandmother's hero. So they had this wonderful life. When the Nazis invaded during World War II, my grandmother happened to be visiting an older sister in Budapest. They got a letter from my great-grandfather immediately, and it said, come home now. My grandmother was with her two sisters, so they packed their suitcases and they got ready to go to the train station. The next day, right before they were about to go to the train station, they got another letter from my great-grandfather. And all it said was, if you can, stay where you are. And that's the last communication that my grandmother ever had with her father. He was taken to Auschwitz where he was killed. His name was Solomon Samuel. In the Jewish tradition, it's customary to name our children after loved ones in our family who are no longer around. And my oldest son is named Solomon, after my great-grandfather. My grandmother says that it was that second letter that saved her from Auschwitz. At first, she thinks her dad panicked and said, come home so we could be together, but then realized his daughters would have a better chance of surviving in a big city where people didn't know they were Jewish and they had places to hide. And he was right. And so my grandmother was on the run. She had a chance to fight for her life. She slept in bombed out buildings. She scraped and clawed for food wherever she could find it. She had and still has every quality and characteristic someone would need to survive something like the Holocaust. She's smart, she's savvy, she's disciplined, she has a tremendous will to live, but she also has great humility because she's the first to say, you could have had all those things back then and it didn't matter. You needed luck and you needed help. And she had quite a bit of both those things. And so I already mentioned the luck, right? When the Nazis invaded, she happened to be visiting a sister in Budapest. Regarding help, there was a soldier who gave her an extra piece of bread when she was starving. There was a fellow prisoner who gave her a pair of pants when she was freezing. There was even someone who gave her a kiss on the cheek, which she said, just gave me hope at that moment, right? When things were so bleak. So my grandmother got help in a variety of places. The most help she got was from a very famous man by the name of Raoul Wallenberg. Some folks are nodding their heads. Hopefully some of you who don't know who Raoul Wallenberg is will Google him and at least look at his face. I wouldn't be here today. And actually none of us would be here, right? Because this wouldn't be happening. But without him, if we want to extrapolate, right? But I literally wouldn't be here without him. Yeah, he's regarded as one of the greatest heroes of the Holocaust. He's credited for saving roughly 100,000 Jews in Budapest. And he saved my grandmother's life twice. And Raoul Wallenberg wasn't Jewish. He just was doing what was right? In this time when there was so much evil and so much darkness and so many terrible things happening, right? You needed to see the goodness in humanity as well, and Raoul Wallenberg was a part of that. So the first way that he saved my grandmother's life was he went to Budapest and he issued false documents, protective passports. They were called Schutzpasses. My grandmother was able to get a pass for herself. She risked her life to obtain 17 passes for other people. She kept going back to the embassy time after time, which was very risky. And I asked her recently, I call her Anyu, which means mother in Hungarian. I said, Anyu, what made you do that? You had your pass. Why did you keep going back? And she said, well, she calls me Tatala. She calls me a lot of things, but mostly that. And she said, Tatala, people needed help, and when you're young, you take risks. And I said, well, a lot of people are lucky you did. And she could have sold those passes or bartered them. These are starving, freezing people. She gave them away to others who needed her help. And so my grandmother was able to survive with her pass from some time. It gave her a level of security against the Nazis. Eventually, it was no longer recognized. She was captured by the Nazis, and she was thrown in the Budapest ghetto. Some of you are probably familiar that during the war, they created ghettos in these cities in Europe to confine Jews in there, waiting to make decisions. They might all be killed, certainly confined, and so my grandmother was placed in the Budapest ghetto where she was a prisoner. I mentioned she had 9 siblings, right? There wasn't good information, so she didn't really know what was happening with her brothers and her sisters. She knew that a couple of her brothers were in working camps, one had already been killed, but she didn't exactly know what was going on with them. In the Budapest ghetto, she was reunited with one of her older brothers, and they stayed together in the ghetto. Towards the end of the war, and by the way, Nazis stayed out of the ghetto. They let Jews administer daily life. There was no food, nothing in or out. They had to figure out how to survive, right? These are very dire circumstances. But Nazis stayed out. They let the Jews kind of figure out what they had to do inside the ghetto. Towards the end of the war, my grandmother and her brother saw 20 Nazis enter the ghetto with machine guns over their shoulders, and word quickly spread that they were there to kill the remaining 80,000 Jews in the ghetto. So think about that, right? I mentioned the numbers of the Holocaust, 6 million Jews killed, millions more. This was an order to kill 80,000 people. And so my grandmother and her brother, they raced up the stairs of the building that they were sleeping in. They found a small attic space, room for about 4 or 5 people. There were more than a dozen of them in there, packed in, fighting for their lives. They waited for 10 minutes, then 20 minutes, and then an hour. Silent. They didn't hear anything. No shots, no screams. They didn't hear anything. And so eventually, they had someone go check what was going on, and the ghetto was clear. The Nazis had retreated. And shortly after that, Russian and Romanian soldiers liberated the ghetto until my grandmother was free to go. That was in 1945. 40 years later, in 1985, and by the way, they didn't know why the Nazis retreated, right? They were just happy to be alive. Some people have asked me, so what'd they do after they were liberated from the ghetto? They were starving, and I asked my grandmother these questions, right, when I was writing the book. I said, Anu, here you are, you're free, what do you do? She said, we found some thread, and we traded that thread for scraps of food. So think about this is how life was at this time. They traded thread for scraps of food. 1945. In 1908, and not knowing why the Nazis retreated. So in 1985, my dad is a big basketball star. My grandmother is living in the Bay Area in a very lovely apartment. A movie is made about Raoul Wallenberg's life. And of course, my grandmother credited Wallenberg with saving her. And so she was eager to watch the movie. And it was in that movie that she saw one of the final scenes of Wallenberg learning of the order to massacre the remaining Jews in the ghetto. And he gets in his car and he races to the gates of the ghetto and he confronts the general, the only man with the authority to call off the massacre. And it was Wallenberg who convinced him not to kill all these people. He said, I'll personally guarantee you'll hang for this. These are innocent people, let them go. And so it took my grandmother 40 years to learn that Raoul Wallenberg saved her life not just once, but twice during the Holocaust. If anyone here has or plans to visit the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., I can't recommend it enough. It's a difficult way to spend a day, but it's an important way because this is what human beings are capable of doing, what we're capable of doing to each other, what's at stake when people aren't treated fairly. And so the Holocaust Museum is just a really, really important place. It's on Raoul Wallenberg Way. That's the name of the street. And when I went there with my grandmother years ago, she said, before we see anything, I need to take you somewhere. And she brought me to a place called Wallenberg's Corner. It was a small little monument. And she just wanted me to look at him and to read, what he had done for her and for so many more. By the way, I actually wrote this for my book, but I had to cut it because it didn't quite work, but I'll tell you all the story. When we were there at the Holocaust Museum reading about Wallenberg, a tour guide brought a group of college kids past Wallenberg, and he said, this right here is a monument to Raoul Wallenberg. He was a big hero in Budapest. I don't have all the details, but he's credited for saving a lot of people. And they started to walk away, and I said, excuse me, sir, I just want to let you know this is my grandmother, and Raoul Wallenberg saved her life twice, and I'm sure she'd be happy to tell these students about what he did for her. And she talked to them for about 20 minutes. They were all crying, right? So it was a good suggestion. But my family story has a lot of darkness, but there's more light, right? And my book is actually a happy, hopeful, inspirational book, despite some of these hard details. Wallenberg is a big part of that. So when my grandmother got home, I told you about this happy home, big family. She would learn that both of her parents and 5 of her siblings were murdered. So I remember asking her when I was writing the book, how do you go on, right? 19 years old, how do you possibly go on with all that loss? And she said, the human instinct is to rebuild. And that's what they did. My grandparents married shortly after the Holocaust, and by the way, my grandfather was in a forced labor camp in Hungary. So he had it better than my grandmother, not that he had it great, but his path was a little bit easier. He was a cook in the labor camp, which my grandmother laughs at because she said he's never cooked a meal in his life, but he could pour things in a pot. And if for those of you who've read my book, I talk about my grandmother's food throughout. She is the most amazing cook. So she laughs at the notion of my grandfather being a cook, but she said, with her accent and the way she says things, she said he had what to eat, right? He had a little bit of food, and he was able to survive. Both of his sisters and both of his parents were killed. And again, now my dad, in America, this big basketball player, how do you connect the dots? And so some folks ask me, well, when did your grandparents meet? They met the day that my grandmother got home. So when she got home from surviving, one of her brothers had also survived, and he was already back. And all my grandmother had on was a raggedy blue overcoat, thin cotton dress, and some beat-up shoes. She wore that every day in Budapest in the freezing winter. My great uncle said, listen, we need to take you to get some clothes. I was in the forced labor camp with a friend who's from this area. He opened a small store when we got home. Let me take you to get some clothes. And it was that day that my grandmother walked through the door of my grandfather's clothing store. They married shortly thereafter and then had my uncle. My uncle was 8 years older than my dad. So my dad was born 8 years later under communism in Romania. He was born at his house, right? I mean, we probably think of births as you go to the hospital and you get an epidural if you choose to get one, and all these very scientific things, right? My dad was born in their house under communism in Romania. In my book, I juxtapose my family's background, which you're hearing about, right, which is the Holocaust, and you'll hear a bit about communism, with my own. I was born into great privilege. At the time of my birth, my dad was a player for the New York Knicks. And my birth was literally planned around the NBA basketball schedule. I'll tell you why. So I was to be delivered by C-section. They knew that. And so my parents planned for my birth to be induced in between two of my dad's road trips for the Knicks. So he went on one road trip, and then he was there for my birth. And then he went on another road trip, and he was there for my bris, which is the Jewish ritual of circumcision on the 8th day, right? So, and I write in my book, for any New Yorkers here, or if you've heard of New York, there's a very, very famous deli called the Carnegie Deli. In Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song, he sings about it. That's how you know it's legit.
It's gone now.
It's gone now, it is. But the Carnegie Deli catered my bris on the house, right? And I write and my dad wore number 18 for the Knicks. And 18 is the most symbolic number in Judaism. It represents chai, which means to life. And so I said, if you're a New York City basketball legend wearing number 18 for the Knicks and you're the son of Holocaust survivors, the Carnegie Deli is going to cater your son's bris, right? That's kind of how it works. That's how I came into the world. My dad had no such luxuries, right? So born under communism. And it's interesting because as I was researching for my book, you know, all I heard growing up was how my dad had to use an outhouse, right? Literally going outside of your house to go to the bathroom. It's like, man, it's cold at night. I'm like, yeah, well, you got to go to the bathroom somewhere, right? So, that's not how I came up. He never had toys. And my grandma, to this day, my grandma's 98, and she still talks about the first toy she got him. She had to go to Bucharest, and it was a sword when he was like 7 years old. And she says that he said to her, just please, can you bring me back a sword? And she said, anything to get him something, right? So this is how he grew up. And I remember asking him when I was writing the book, what was it like growing up so poor? You know, and he didn't hesitate. He said, you know, I didn't grow up poor. To you, I did, because you know different, right? You're used to different. But for me, I had friends. I had a big brother I loved so much. I had food on the table. That's all I needed. You know, he by his account, he had a good life. But for my grandparents, it was very brutal, right? Communism, and again, my grandmother still talks about how hard it was under communism. And I know there's some history professors here who might know a little bit about communism and the Romanians and communism. They were known for their brutality. So my grandparents had friends who were jailed, tortured, or killed for saying one word against the government, for having any money that they weren't supposed to have, right? These were really, really difficult times. It took my family 10 years to get visas to leave communism. 10 years. Later on, I'll tell you how it took my dad 24 hours to become an American citizen because of his basketball ability, right? So a lot can change over generations. 10 years. They had passports to go to the state of Israel, right, the Jewish homeland. And Israel was created to protect and preserve the Jewish people after the Holocaust. And it was Israel who offered to pay money for each Jewish family that the communists would allow to leave. And so my uncle and my grandmother were taking Hebrew lessons. They were ready to go to Israel. I'll share this story with you. So I mentioned, you know, friends being jailed, tortured, and killed, and illegal money. You weren't allowed to have money under communism. You know, you worked for the state, they gave you rations, and that was kind of how it worked. But in order to have anything, you had to kind of transact on the black market. And I write in the book, it was illegal, but it wasn't shameful, right? It was the only way to live. And my grandfather was very good at it. He just knew how to operate. He was kind of known around town. So over 10 long years, they were able to save up $1,000 worth of Romanian money and 4,000 American dollars. If they were caught with this money, they would have been in big, big, big trouble. But they had chutzpah, which is a word you may have heard. They have guts. And you know, they had worked for this money and they wanted to keep it. They actually hid it in an old clock radio in their apartment. And the communists used to come in and just search the apartment at a whim. And my grandmother tells the story of them coming in and grabbing the radio and saying, where's the certificate for this? And they said, well, we don't have it. Or where are the papers? And my grandma said, we don't have it. And he looked at it, and he threw it on the ground, and they kind of held their breath, and it just stayed there. And they moved on, and they said, phew, if he only knew, right? There were $4,000 in there. So when they got their papers to leave Romania, they weren't allowed to take anything of value with them, nothing. My grandmother had this Rosenthal porcelain that she loved, that she had a couple rings. They couldn't take anything. They couldn't even have this money, let alone take it. But they said, we have to figure out how to get this money out. This isn't a spoiler, so you should still read the book, but they got every cent of their money out, and I'll tell you how. For the Romanian money, my grandfather, he hatched an ingenious plan. He said, okay, we're leaving on a train. The night before they were set to leave, he had asked around town, what train are we leaving on? So he knew what train they would leave on. The night before they left, he snuck out of the house, pitch black, middle of the night with a friend standing his watch, and he went to the train station. And he found the train that they were going to leave on, and he shimmied his way on board, and he had the money in his pocket, and he stuck it under a seat at the front of the train. And when they got there the next morning, they went from Romania to Serbia to Rome. So when they left Romania, my grandmother, again, 98, still talks about her 8-year-old son, my dad, having to put his arms up as the communists shouted in his face, do you have anything? Do you have any money? They all said, we don't have anything. The communists just didn't know the money was already on board. So they left Romania. When they got to Italy, my grandfather let people disembark. He went to the seat, he got his money, and he was on his way. That was the Romanian money, but the American dollars were a lot riskier, and there were a lot more of them. And so they thought, how the hell are we going to get this money out, right? My grandmother had a cousin, unfortunately, who passed away a month ago in Budapest. So he lived a long, full life, also a Holocaust survivor. May he rest in peace. He was a production assistant on a movie set in Budapest. And the film's biggest star was a man named Buddy Hackett. Of course, so there's a lot of the older folks laughing, and some of the younger maybe haven't heard of Buddy Hackett. Fair to say, everyone? Right? Okay, maybe a generational thing. Buddy Hackett was probably the most famous comedian of the generation. Or Adam Sandler. That's my second Adam Sandler reference today. I'm going to go for another one. I'll figure it out. He had been on The Tonight Show like 80 times, right? Buddy Hackett was a Jewish guy from outside of New York, from New York City, actually, from Brooklyn, filming a movie in Budapest, and my cousin George was his translator and personal assistant. And my grandmother and grandpa said, well, wait a second. If he would take our money back and send it to my brother, my grandmother's brother, who she survived the ghetto with, he was now in the Bronx. They said, if he would take it back and send it to him, maybe that would work. And so my cousin George approached Buddy Hackett, and he said, hey, my cousins are Holocaust survivors, and they need your help. Would you be willing to help them? He said, if you get me the money, it's done. And so my grandmother, it's a story, and it's all in the book. She had to sew a false bottom into a suitcase. They had to transport it on a train, had someone else transport it who didn't even know it was there. It was a whole operation. It eventually hit Buddy Hackett's hands. It was no longer contraband. It was money that belonged to an American celebrity. He filmed his movie in Budapest. He took it back to the United States, sent it to my great uncle Andy in the Bronx with an extra $50 on top. And in today's money, that's more than $1,000. There was a handwritten note, and all it said is, good luck in America, sincerely, Buddy Hackett. And I said to my grandmother, do you have that note? She goes, no, we threw it out. I said, that was a mistake. So, all right, we're moving on. Yeah, exactly. Well, okay. But again, we're talking about the darkness of some of the things my family has been through, but then the kindness that is in people's hearts, right? And Buddy Hackett is an example of that. I got an email a few months ago in my inbox, woke up in the morning, from Sandy Hackett. As soon as I saw it, I knew who it was. It was Buddy Hackett's oldest son. This word of the book had reached him, and the story, and we got on the phone. We talked for 45 minutes. He was actually in Budapest at that time. He didn't know about this part of the story, but it was amazing. You know, he's been a comedian just like his father, but you know, generations being able to connect over this great deed that they did. By the way, once my grandparents had made good in America, and my dad is this big basketball star, they were vacationing in Las Vegas. And they went to see Buddy Hackett perform. He was a headliner in Las Vegas. And my grandmother said it was very ugly, the humor, because he was very crass, you know, and he cursed a lot. But she said he talked about his son's bar mitzvah at the end, and I really liked that. So that was her impression of the show. After the show, they had dinner with friends, and my grandmother told the story. She said, you know, and they'd never met. They'd never met. He just took the money, and she said, you know, this is what he did, and he helped us so much. One of her friends excused himself from the table, talked his way up to Buddy Hackett's hotel suite and said, hey, those Holocaust survivors you helped all those years ago in Hungary, they're here. And he said, bring them up. And so my grandparents spent the night with Buddy Hackett drinking liquor and reminiscing. And he knew of my dad. My dad's playing for the New York Knicks, right? So regarding this story, I say, truth is stranger than fiction, right? And this is one of those examples, but it really does show, again, what we're capable of, right? And when I talk about the Holocaust and communism, what we can do to each other is mind-boggling, but what we can do for each other is also very powerful, right? So Raoul Wallenberg, Buddy Hackett, big part of that. So I mentioned that my family was bound for Israel. They spent 6 months in Rome. My grandfather wanted to come to the United States. You know, he thought it was a land of opportunity, and my grandma still says I could say no to him, that wasn't a problem. But my uncle, my dad's older brother, was dating a girl in Romania who had recently come to the States, and he wanted to be an American, and she said I couldn't say no to him. So they worked with an organization called HIAS. Some folks here know HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. They work with refugees all over the world, today, then and today. Ukraine, all these things that are happening around the world, HIAS is there to help people. HIAS helped my family come to America. And so in 1964, they landed at JFK Airport, first time in America, right? My dad was 9 years old. He spoke fluent Hungarian, Romanian, and Italian, 3 languages fluently. Didn't speak a word of English and had never touched a basketball. At this time, he called my uncle, his brother, what he called him in their native language, Hungarian, translates to English as my king. Think about that, right? I have 2 boys. For my youngest to call my oldest my king, right? That's saying something, right? How much my dad loved his brother, right? My family's living the American dream already. It's the first time my grandparents can speak their minds, can work for a living, can have their sons get an education. This is the American dream, regardless of what happens. A few months after arriving in America, my uncle was diagnosed with leukemia. It was terminal. And he passed away within a year, at 17 years old. So you could imagine all the loss of the Holocaust, right? For my grandmother losing 5 siblings and both parents. My grandfather losing both his sisters and both his parents, to come to America and have a chance at a better life, and then for my uncle to pass. And I mentioned my son is named after my great-grandfather. I'm named after my uncle. So his name was Lutzi in Hungarian, Leslie in English, and my middle name is Leslie, after him. And I'm very honest in the book about the obligation I feel, you know, how he didn't get a chance to live out his dreams. I carry his name, right? So it was mentioned I was an academic All-American at Stanford, and I was an all-conference basketball player, and I'm proud of those things, but he has a lot to do with that. And this whole history has a lot to do with that. So you can put yourself in your dad's shoes, in my dad's shoes at this moment. 10 years old, his hero just passed away. Kids in New York City are making fun of him because he can't speak the language. And so he did what all kids in New York, as he says it, were doing at the time. He went to the local park, and what they did at the park is they played basketball. And he says, if you could play ball in the neighborhood, right? This is the 60s and 70s in New York City. He said, if you could play basketball, that's how you made friends. He said, I just wanted to make friends and belong to something. And I could say, well, you must have made a lot of friends, because sometimes things just click. And I don't think my dad would have flown so far, so fast with basketball had it not been taking him away from all these very painful things, right? We all have things we go through in our lives that are difficult, and we need distractions, things to focus on. Basketball for my dad wasn't a game. It was a new life. It was salvation. So it didn't take him long to be one of the best players in the playground, and then one of the best players in the city, and then one of the best players in the country. It was a phenomenon in New York City. He was so great that it almost defied convention, right? Here's this European guy who's so good at this one thing. What's interesting is, and again, talking about my upbringing, being born around the game, my parents, particularly my mom, drove me to all my games. My sister came and supported me. My dad worked with me on my skills in our private hoop in the driveway, right? That's my background. My grandparents didn't see my dad play basketball until he was a junior in high school, not one time. They had opened up a fabric store in the Bronx, and they have this immigrant mentality, work for a living, build a life. My dad's games were in the early afternoon. So in order to see my dad play high school basketball, they'd have to close their store early. That's their income source. And my grandma still says, you know, I'd have to tell your grandfather, leave something for tomorrow. He just work. And that's a big value in our life. And again, when I mentioned some of the success I've had on the court and in the classroom, that's where I get it from, right? You just have to outwork people, and that's what my grandparents were doing. So one day they get a call in their fabric store, and it's my dad's high school coach. And my grandmother answers. She says, Mrs. Grunfeld, you need to come see your son play basketball. He's really special. And so she said, okay. Well, so they closed the store early the following week to go to a game, but not early enough. And so when they got there, it was in the middle of the winter. The gym was closed. The game had already started. They were late. And so they got to the door, and the usher was there. He said, we can't let you in. The game started. My grandfather's English was not very good, and he tried to convince him, we're guests of coach, we're parents of player. He said, listen, I can't help you. You're late. You have to be on time. And for whatever reason, my grandmother said, our son's name is Ernie Grunfeld. And he went, why didn't you say that? Took them into the gym. First time, they're looking around, and my grandfather nudged my grandmother in Hungarian and said, well, if Ernie is such a great player, why isn't he on the court? Why isn't he playing? And my grandmother grabbed him, and she said, look right there, that's Ernie. He was in the middle of the floor, but my grandfather couldn't recognize him. The transformation, almost before his very eyes, right? This immigrant, at-risk youth had evolved and turned into something powerful, right? And so my grandfather used to make my dad come to their fabric store every Saturday to work, which he did not enjoy. And on the court after the game, he said, you never come to the store again. Just focus on your basketball, we'll do the rest. By the following year, he was an All-American, one of the most highly recruited players in the country, had his pick of colleges. He chose to go to the University of Tennessee. At that time, the great players from New York City were going down south. That was very common. The following year, he was an all-conference player at Tennessee his first year. First team All-SEC, phenomenon. The next year, he was joined by another New Yorker named Bernard King. We've been talking about him earlier today. Bernard King led the NBA in scoring, Hall of Famer. My dad and Bernard King are regarded as one of the greatest duos in college basketball history. They were known as the Ernie and Bernie show. ESPN made a 30 for 30 documentary about them called Bernie and Ernie. I always tell audiences, read my book first, but then watch the movie. It's a good movie. Bernard King was a black man from Brooklyn, New York. My dad is this white immigrant from Queens, New York. Their lives would never have intersected, their paths would never have crossed had it not been for basketball. They went down to Knoxville, Tennessee. They became legends separately and together. They still talk every month. I call him Uncle B. There's a quote from him on the back of my book. It's a really great representation of what the game can do. And not just the game of basketball, anything we care about. You're part of a community at EMU, right? These communities that bring us together are so powerful, and my dad and Bernard King are a great example of that. And so my dad had this storied career at Tennessee. He ended it as the school's all-time leading scorer, and the second leading scorer in the history of the SEC, which is the best conference in the country for basketball. The first leading scorer is a guy named Pete Maravich. Some of you know of. One of the all-time great players. That was in the 70s when my dad's career ended. To this day, he's the fifth leading scorer in the SEC. So just shows you how amazing he was in college. In his first few years in Tennessee, he had a chance to represent the United States, which again is such a thrill coming to this country from Europe. And so the first competition was an international cup competition, and they practiced in Providence, Rhode Island, and at the end of one of the last practices, the coaches said, okay, bring your passports because we're going to go overseas soon. And my dad walked up to them and they said, well, I don't have a passport, but I have a green card. I said, well, wait a second, this is Team USA. You need to be a citizen. Everyone panicked, but then they realized that because he had been in the country for 10 years, he was eligible for a passport. They flew him to Washington, D.C. All his papers were filled out. They flew him back to Providence 24 hours later with his passport in his hand. So when I told you it took my grandparents 10 years, it took my dad 24 hours, right? Went overseas, played really well, went on another international competition, played really well. Then he had a chance to travel for the United States Olympic team. The Olympics, right? Think about that. Think about this history I've just recounted to you, the Olympics for the United States of America. Dean Smith is a very famous basketball coach from the University of North Carolina, Coach Michael Jordan there. He was the coach of the team. And so they had tryouts. Back then it was college players who played in the Olympics. There were about 60 to 80 or so of the best college players in the country trying out to be an Olympian. And my dad tried out for that team, and my dad made that team. And so this time, my grandparents closed their store for 2 weeks, and they drove from Queens, New York to Montreal, Canada, and they watched my dad stand on top of the Olympic podium as a gold medalist for the United States of America. When I talk to groups like this one, it's really this moment where, if you think things are impossible, just reflect on this history I've shared with you. And again, I relate it to my background, right? And getting a scholarship to Stanford and doing these things that are like, okay, cool, that's all good stuff. A big reason why I was able to do those things is because I believed they were possible. because I had seen what my grandparents overcame and I had seen what my dad overcame, right? And so that's such a big part of it, just the belief that things are possible. And so, beautiful moment, of course, for my dad to become an Olympic gold medalist. He was the 11th pick in the NBA draft. He had a good NBA career. He wasn't a superstar. His teammate Bernard King was a superstar. And my dad tells funny stories about scouts when they were coming out of college, looking at them both and saying, oh, I don't know which one you could pick. They're both so good. And as rookies, my dad averaged 7 points and Bernard King averaged 24 points. So it became clear rather quickly who the right choice was there. But and then he was an NBA executive, as I mentioned, for 30 years, right? And so proud of what he's accomplished, how he's handled himself, how he's treated others. You know, my dad been highly criticized by media because that's what happens when you sit in those chairs and you have to make those big decisions. But people who know him always say, you know, Ernie he's very modest and he treats people fairly, decently, and he doesn't talk badly about people. And now that my book is out and they've read the story, they understand why that is, right? Because he was bullied as an immigrant in New York City. He never had grandparents. They were all killed in Auschwitz, right? So that's kind of how he learned to treat people. And so I'm prouder of that and the type of father he is than I am of his great accomplishments, although I'm quite proud of that. And so, listen, it's always really meaningful for me to visit communities, to be able to talk about this story because it means so much to me, because it's informed who I am so much, right? How I go about my business, how I try to outwork people, not only in the basketball court, in the classroom, and my current job, right? Those are the values of my family that I am carrying forward. And so I hope articulating the story to you all will at least give you a small piece of it. If you read it, you'll get more of it. How many of you in this room, just a quick show of hands, have ever met a Holocaust survivor? It's a nice amount, but certainly a lot of you haven't. So hopefully today you've gotten a sense of my grandmother. Certainly if you read my book, you'll know one. She's the star of our family. She's the star of our story. And so just a great privilege for me to be able to tell you all about her. So let me stop there, and I thank you all so much, particularly the students. I know you have a lot of things you could be doing tonight. Most of them probably more fun than this, but this is enriching in different ways, right? So thank you for spending time. And with that, I'd love to answer questions.
So I can bring the microphone around and take questions.
Don't be shy either. We're all friends here.
Thank you so much for a really amazing presentation. I just wanted to let you know that Raoul Wallenberg lived in Ann Arbor.
You know what? I knew that. I should have mentioned that. The University of Michigan, they claimed him rightfully because he
Rightfully so. That's right. He lived at 1408 Wells Street in the Burns Park neighborhood. And you can drive by and wave. And
are there people living there now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're very proud to call him one of our own.
Thank you for sharing that. That's right.
Yeah, thank you. Just a little more on Wallenberg. There is an area on campus that's dedicated to him with a statue and a plaque talking about his accomplishments. So it's not just that he lived there. There is a little area that you can visit.
I encourage all the students, everyone in the room, to look at that. I mean, because really he's a hero. And you know what's interesting about that? My grandmother still sheds tears over Wallenberg because she says he did everything for us, but we couldn't do anything for him. He was apprehended by the Russians after the war, never seen again, dead. So he risked his life and he lost his life just to help people. And this was like 3 months ago. I was spending time with my grandmother in the Bay Area, and we were just talking about it. And she was crying, and she shared a detail with me that I wish she would have shared with me before I wrote the book, because I would have put it in there. She said, "Tugla, you know how old he was when he did this?" And I had never even considered it, because to me, he's like larger than life hero who saved my grandmother's life. So no, how old was he? He says he was 31. To you students, that's really old, right? Not so old. I'm past that. Some other folks are even more past that. Like it's not so old, right? So at 31 years old, he did that. So I was just floored by that.
I'm sorry, I heard you say the name, but can you spell the name of the person we were just talking about who saved your grandmother?
Yes. You're a student?
Yeah.
Thank you for asking the first question from a student. That takes guts, so I always appreciate that. I can spell Raoul Wallenberg because I Google it so much and I always get it. Wow, this is actually a lot of pressure. It's a hard. It is R-A-O-U-L, right? But it's tricky. R-A-O-U-L Wallenberg. W-A-L-L-E-N-B-E-R-G. Yeah, read about him. Read about him. And thank you for asking that. What's that?
Oh, could you repeat it?
Sure. You want to check if I can do it again? R-A-O-U-L-W-A-L-L-E-N-B-E-R-G. I don't know, like a ding. You know that?
That was the same.
How in depth did your father discuss the difficulties with learning English? Because of course English can be a very difficult language to learn if it's not your first language, and just like how did that affect him in school with his academics and just with his basketball career?
That is an awesome question and very insightful, as if you've read my book, because that's a very big theme, language, right? Because basketball is a universal language. And I know that I played overseas with guys I didn't speak the same language as, but we cooperated and were able to work together, right? So learning English, listen, he got it. If you hear him today, you wouldn't know he's not from America. No, you know, that he's not a native speaker. But it was a challenge at first. And he's very good at math. And he's very good with numbers. And he says, like, that was, because that's what's universal at that time, right? So, and I kind of note that in the book, that like he was numbers, like he was good with numbers. And there's also part of the book where, because my dad is my height, but he's much bigger than me. Like he's just, like, and I'm a big person, right? My wedding ring can fit inside of his wedding ring. So his finger is like the thickness of like, it's a very big guy. And so I said when he came to America, he was a third grader, as big as a fifth grader, but they put him in class with the first graders. So he looked like he should be teaching the class, right? So he just did, and he was trying to learn the language, and there was a student in the class who was a little advanced, who the teacher, Miss Kincaid, I know her name because my dad still remembers, like, yeah, Miss Kincaid helped me. And this student would sit in the back of my dad and point to pictures and tell him what they meant. You know, and he's still one of my dad's closest friends. They stayed dear friends for life after that. But it was a challenge. And he was made fun of. And there's a story in the book where he got beat up and he got his revenge on that person. Once, because, you know, tables turn sometimes. But I think that how great he was at basketball, some of that was driving him, right? No, like, not fitting in, not being accepted. That's why he accepts people, because he knows kind of what it's like. Interestingly, his native language is Hungarian, which is regarded as one of the most difficult languages to learn. Some of you who know languages, like, it doesn't really have analogs. It's related to Finnish a little bit, Germanic like a little bit, but when people say to him, like, you know Hungarian? How did you learn that? And he just says, hey, if you grow up there, you just speak it, right? Like so he knows actually one language that's like universally really, really hard to know, but he figured English out. And actually, this is interesting, when he retired as a player for the Knicks, he had opportunities to play elsewhere, but the Knicks offered him a job broadcasting games on the radio. When he first came to America, my grandparents wanted him to go to a yeshiva, which is like there's some laughter here, like, it's like a school that mixes like Jewish education with more like secular education, whatever, but they wouldn't let him in because he didn't speak English. He was denied, so he went to PS 101. And then all these years later, he's announcing games on the radio in New York City, right, in English. So the language piece of it is really, really important. So thank you for the question. Yeah, appreciate it.
Any more? I don't think enough.
Dan, this has been a very, very, not just informative, but a real simpatico kind of feeling about basketball. I also want to point out that Eric, sitting, I have fun, I'm embarrassed.
Oh, you're okay. Embarrassed?
So,
this is fun. Yeah,
so Eric is the trainer that I work out with. And he treats me harshly. That's an editorial.
yes.
But Eric and I suddenly one day started talking about basketball, and I started remembering things that have tracked along in my lifetime. And as we talked, I told him about you and your book, and he was motivated to come here tonight. I'm so pleased.
All right, thank you. You know, if you read my book, I write about my trainer, right? Because I had a very bad knee injury, and I had a trainer who brought me through that, helped me, so we understand how powerful trainers can be in our lives. So
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
This is just like a little fun fact. I was wondering, did you like ever try to pick up basketball since your dad was like a basketball player?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Very, very much. Yeah. It's all I knew growing up. It's all I knew growing up. So actually, and I read in the book, like I went to Hebrew school. A Jewish kid from the, from the burbs, went to Hebrew school with my friends, and they went around the class and said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I kind of was like, "What do I want to be?" Like, I'm going to be an NBA basketball player. Everyone started laughing, because it wasn't the traditional path for someone in that stage. But yeah, listen, I just wanted to do what my dad did, and I loved the game. I loved everything about it. Like we were talking, I could still all day just talk about when my body was a little more spry, played it, quite a bit, and it'll always be a big part of my life, always. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and then we're back there. We'll get to it. Yeah, no, we're good. Whatever you want. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask about your sons. Are they interested in basketball as well?
It's a great question. You think about, like, as parents, what do you want your kids to do, right? For me, I want my kids to be happy, healthy, find what they love to do. And actually, my parents were that way with me, related to your question, right? Because people sometimes ask me, like, your dad was this great player and this executive, how was that? And I'm very honest in the book, there was a lot of pressure. Because everyone always said, oh, it's Ernie's son. Of course he's on the All-Star team, it's Ernie's son. So I felt that pressure, but never from my parents. My dad would always say to me, don't play basketball unless you want to. Like, do what you want to do. And I'm like that with my kids very much. That being, and also they're 4-1. So we've kind of buried that lead a little bit. I didn't get there. But there are little tight hoops around the house. There are basketballs everywhere. Like, and it's funny because I just took my oldest to the doctor. He's 4, and there's a toy store next to it. The doctor, he's not like my dad in Communist Romania, let's put it that way. And I told my wife, I was like, I'm gonna take him to the toy store, but I'm not gonna get him a toy. He's got, you know what I mean? Like, we'll walk around, we'll have fun. And we were walking around, and he went to this bin of balls, and he picked up this basketball. It was plastic, and he started bouncing it, and I was like, yeah, bring it up. And I was like, 2 seconds, I couldn't, like, and so right away, I was like, yeah, he'll get that, sure. So, listen, but if he likes baseball, or if he likes the arts, honestly, my oldest, he loves letters and reading and all these things, so it's like wonderful, supporting you through that. But if they love hoops, that'd be fun, because it's one thing I know, so we could talk about it.
I came in late because I was looking for the room, so I missed the beginning. What's the name of your book?
I was just saying, I'll just go back to the beginning and do it again. My book, there it is right there. It's called By the Grace of the Game. And it took me years to think of the title.
If anyone wants to take a picture of it after.
Yeah, thank you for that, yeah. Like, the word grace in the title is important to me because there is something spiritual about basketball in my family's life, just because of the story I told you, like how it shined its light on my dad when he needed it, right? So the grace piece of it, and then my grandmother, which you'll learn from the book, she really is the epitome of grace. Like, she's 1 in a billion, and so, yeah, that title took us a long time, but we're happy with it. So, thank you.
Hi, I was really just curious if you think that New York as a particular place played a particular role in the formation of basketball, or let's say you moved to Los Angeles or Las Vegas or any other city, if that would change anything at all.
I'm shaking my head at you?
Why?
Because it's such a good question. It's just like, I'm just like, it gets me so excited. I'm like, God, that's a great question. So we talked about the book, right? And like, I wrote it, we were discussing, like, it's not a memoir, it's a family story. My grandmother's the main character, my dad is one of the main characters. I matter just because I fit into it all, but I'm just kind of like a little bit, but New York City, I say, is the main character. So it's a very good question. 1,000,000%. If they go to anywhere else. You mentioned LA, but even if it's Pittsburgh or even if it's wherever, like New York City is the mecca of basketball at that time. It's just like what it was and I write about it in the book. I said it was the rhythm of the streets. It was the way people communicated. So who knows what he would have been if it weren't in New York City. Like, and it's for all of us, like what we're good at, what we get, like what we find. It kind of, you need luck and circumstance, and sometimes things come together. They talk about that with Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, who started Microsoft. They happen to grow up in like Washington, where they had the first computer. Where like, oh, they're like, oh, now we can learn about computers. It's like, oh, $8 billion later, that was a good coincidence, right? Like, things happen that way, but 100% that New York City was a big, big, big part of why this all happened. It was an awesome question. Thank you.
Have your family members been back to Romania since in the past years?
So I have, because I played for the Romanian national basketball team, which is detailed in the book. That was a short stint for things. If you read the book, you can learn about. But I didn't go back to the area where my family's from. My dad has not been back. He did, when he was playing in the NBA, go to Budapest, and he did a clinic, for a basketball clinic in Hungarian for young players, which was cool. My grandparents, when my grandfather passed away in 1986, and he was very sick, and he said to my grandmother, I need to go back. I just need to like see it again. And they went back, and it was still communism, and they were there for 24 hours, and people were asking questions, and they said, we need to get out of here. They stayed for 24 hours and they left. And as much as my grandmother talks, of course, the Holocaust and these things that happened, what they went through under communism and how people were treated, she says that's why like some of the current events today, and people talk about communism, and I have particular sensitivities to that because that was very brutal stuff for them. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, no more facts about Raoul, but I have a question. For many Holocaust survivors, children, they don't know what their parents' experience was because it's traumatic and they don't talk about it. What was it like for you? Did your parents and grandparents talk about their experience, or did you learn most of it by your interviews in writing the book?
Yeah, another great question. So you often find it's a binary with Holocaust survivors. Either they won't talk about it or they feel compelled to. And you have to respect that, right? Everyone processes trauma differently. Unfortunately, my grandfather passed away when I was a baby, so I didn't get to know him. My grandmother always talked about it. And people say to me who are in similar family dynamics, they say, you're lucky because my grandparents never talked about it. And I am lucky. My dad never talked about it. In fact, I always knew more than him even before I wrote the book. But reading the book, he learned what happened. Because he was born from the ashes of the Holocaust, literally. So they're just moving away from all this terrible stuff. It's very common with third generation, like myself, whose grandparents survived. We can draw inspiration from it and learn from it. It's a hard history to process, and you just kind of have to make space for them to do it as it's comfortable. If you read the book, the detail of her experiences at that time is really incredible. And so people have said to me, it's like you were there. How did you recreate it? I'm not taking credit for that. That's my grandmother. And I'm lucky for that too. Like, she's 98, and I'll call my dad and say, hey Dad, like, when you were in New York, and I'll just ask him a random question, he'll be like, I don't know, ask about you. I don't know, ask about you. Because he doesn't remember anything. She remembers everything. And so I did a year and a half when I was in business school. I would come home from class, I'd call her up, I'd record the conversation, and I would just ask her every question in the book. What crops did your father grow in his orchard? In the book, there's like 30 crops. And I had to make a decision, do I list them all? And I was like, yeah, I'm listing them all. Because she knew every detail, even to this day, so I'm just lucky for a lot of reasons.
Thank you.
Yeah. By the way, if I may, I talked a little bit about my great uncle who she survived the ghetto with. His job in the ghetto was to pick up dead bodies off the street and bring them into a warehouse and stack them on top of each other in a crisscross pattern. That was his job. And he never talked about it. Never. So, he was in New York City. I knew him. He never talked about it. So,